alone was a lot more fun than explaining to her second cousin that, yes, after dating for over 10 years, Matt really had left her at the altar. He had actually said their decision to marry had seemed sudden, and that he'd needed more time. And yes, he had run off to Las Vegas 2 weeks later, marrying his receptionist. She refused to think about the conversation she'd had on the subject with her mother. But knowing that she would soon be leaving Seattle for Blackberry Island had kept her going. She'd focused on her escape. Then she'd packed up her place in the city and headed north. Andi squeezed the keys her real estate agent had handed her, feeling the metal dig into her skin. The pain brought her back to the present, to this moment where there were only possibilities. She got out of her car and stared at the broken house. But instead of boarded windows and a sagging porch, she saw what it would be. New, shiny, a home people would admire, not a cast-off. Because when the house was restored, Andi could call her mother and talk about that. It would be a far better conversation than listening to the woman list everything Andi had messed up in her life. Like not allowing Matt to guide her into changing herself, and how she'd foolishly let a good man get away. Andi turned to admire the view. On a clear day, the water of Puget Sound sparkled. Granted, clear days were relatively rare in this part of the country, but Andi was okay with that. She liked the rain. The gray, drizzly sky, the squish of her boots against the sidewalk. All that gloom made her appreciate the sunny days. She turned west, looking out over the Sound. The houses had a perfect view. They'd originally been built by sea captains, oriented to watch the ships sail in. In the late 1800s, seafaring had still been important to the area, not yet overtaken by the lure of logging. This was right, she thought happily. She belonged here, or she would belong, with time. If the renovation started to get to her, she would simply look at her view. The dance of the water, the peninsula beyond were far different from the high-rises of downtown Seattle. The city might only be a couple of hours away by car, but it was another planet when compared to the small town that was Blackberry Island. "Hello. Are you the one who bought the house?" Andi turned and saw a woman walking toward her. She was of average height, with long dark red hair that flowed halfway down her back. She wore jeans and clogs, with an ivory cable-knit sweater that just grazed her hips. Her face was more interesting than pretty, Andi thought as she approached. High cheekbones and large green eyes. Her pale skin was probably a result of both genetics and a complete lack of sun exposure since the previous September. "Hi. Yes, I am." The woman smiled. "Finally. That poor place. It's been so lonely. Oh, I'm Boston King." She pointed to the house with the sculpture of the bird on the lawn. "I live there." "Andi Gordon." They shook hands. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds and highlighted what looked like a dark purple streak in Boston's hair. Andi fingered her own dark hair and wondered if she should do something as dramatic. The most she'd ever managed was a trim. "Any relation to Zeke King?" Andi asked. "He's the contractor I've been emailing about the house." Boston's expression brightened. "My husband. He and his brother own a local firm here on the island. He'd mentioned he'd been in touch with the new owner." She tilted her head. "But he didn't say anything about you, and I'm dying to know the details. Can you spare a few minutes? I just put on a fresh pot of coffee." Andi thought about the cleaning supplies in the back of her SUV. With the moving van arriving in the morning, she had plenty to do to get the place ready. But there were only 3 houses on the small cul-de-sac, and getting to know one of her neighbors seemed just as important. "I'd love a cup of coffee," she said. Boston led the way across the ragged grass to her own yard, then up the steps to the front door. Andi noticed the boards that made up the porch floor had been painted dark blue, and there were stars and planets scattered around. The front door was dark wood with stained glass panels. The eclectic mix of traditional decor and whimsy continued in the foyer. A Shaker-style bench stood by a coat rack. On the wall was a mirror framed by silver squirrels and birds. The living room to the left had comfortable sofas and chairs, but there was a huge painting of a naked fairy over the fireplace. Boston led the way down